if you want to get top marks, you have to know this moment well. So this is ignorance and want. And the reason I think this is such an important moment for everyone to learn really well is because of the analysis that it allows for. It allows you to do such a good analysis because it's so rich in its imagery, and you can really tie into Dickens's broader humanitarian social message about the poor. Now, before we go ahead and analyze ignorance and want, which is the last part of stage 3, it's important we're familiar with the context that links to this moment. Now, this isn't the only context that links, but this is an important piece of context that does link. So this man right here is William Beveridge, and he wrote an article and a social policy on how to address poverty in the 19th century. Now, within this policy, this article that he wrote, he outlined 5 giant evils, not 5 great evils, 5 giant evils that need to be addressed for those that are living in poverty. You do not have to know every single one of these, but want and ignorance are important. Ignorance is to do with the lack of education that those in poverty had. Want is all to do with the basic necessities in order to survive: healthcare, food, the basics that the poor need in order to function in society. Now, his report was influential in the development of the welfare state, which the welfare state is, as we know it today, free healthcare, the NHS, social housing, etc. Now, the Beveridge report links to ignorance and want directly. So let's have a look at some of the imagery used to describe ignorance and want. And I've put here just a collection of quotes that all link to the 2 vulnerable children. And I've kind of separated it into 3 parts. So firstly, we've got claw, monster's disheveled hand. And in the description here of ignorance and want, not only are they dehumanized because they're described as literal monsters and as having a claw, but you have this imagery of danger, like the connotations of a monster being quite dangerous. It's this terrifying imagery of danger, and it should inspire fear. Now, is Dickens saying that you should be scared of the poor? No, but he is saying, look at the product of what the wealthy have created. Like, this terrifying danger that supposedly the poor pose is inspired and created and walked by those in power. So we're meant to be scared of this moment, and Dickens creates the children in a way where Scrooge should be afraid of these children, because in this moment he's confronting the product of his own stinginess and his own lack of regard for those that are in poverty. Then I've taken these 2 quotes here. Both of them are very similar in their description, but they both make use of similar literary techniques to get their message across. So you have wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, and miserable. And then you have yellow, meagre, ragged, scowling, and wolfish. Now, in both of these quotes, this is just a basic analysis. They both use asyndetic listing. I mean, Dickens could have just described them as meagre and frightful, but he's decided to give this long list of words to describe ignorance and want, again, to emphasize and exaggerate the neglect and the impoverished condition of the children. You can go ahead and closely analyze any of these words in a paragraph that you wanted to unpick. Wolfish is quite interesting because you have that zoomorphism, the description of the children as animals. You've also got meager and ragged, showing their horrible condition that they're in, the physical state that they're in. Yellow, which are connotations of sickness. Hideous, again, like the appearance of these children is exaggerated to depict society's neglect. And it highlights their suffering, and it shows that they're a product of society's mistreatment. The last quote I've taken out is interesting, and I don't think many people talk about this one. The narrator describes the children and says, "Where angels might have sat enthroned, devils lurked and glared out menacing." Now, the obvious thing to point out here is the religious imagery and the contrast between angels and devils. Now, the narrator suggesting that angels should be sat enthroned on the children suggests that an image of divine protection, that these children should be protected and nurtured and should be guided because, they are the future of society. But instead of the angels lurking, the devils lurked. suggesting this idea of, evilness and this idea of misguidance. And, these children should be nurtured into, commendable citizens of the Victorian era, but instead devils are lurking, suggesting that this isn't just an economical issue, but this is a moral and spiritual and religious failing of the rich. The presentation of ignorance and want overall here demonstrates how society has failed the most vulnerable, and not only failed them in terms of economic safety, but also in terms of morality and also in terms of spirituality. Remembering that the Victorian era was a largely Christian society, Dickens makes use of this to get his humanitarian message across, suggesting that we should be protecting the children, but instead we failed them on a spiritual level. We've allowed the devils to lurk as a result of capitalism and the mistreatment and exploitation of children. The next quote I've picked out is again this, and notice how there is so much rich analysis that you can get out of Ignorance and Want. Like, I highly recommend you learn this section well and you go over it multiple times, because you can apply it to so many different essays. So the next quote is, "A shriveled hand like that of age had pinched and twisted and pulled them into shreds." Now, we'll talk about the shriveled hand, but before we do, pinched, twisted, pulled. You have this tricolon, which means list of three, of violent verbs. Now, what do these violent verbs symbolize, and what meaning can we get out of them? I mean, firstly, there's the physical connotations of literally destroying the children in the Victorian era, but it also has the imagery of neglect, mistreatment, and I thought this part is really interesting. Pull them into shreds. You have the disintegration of the young people and this fragmented sense of who they are because of the suffering. They've literally been ripped apart and torn to pieces and fragmented at this shriveled hand. Like, the shriveled hand has caused them to do this. Now, the shriveled hand could be symbolic of many things. It could be symbolic of Scrooge and his treatment of young people. It could be symbolic of capitalism and how, the capitalist industrial society, this is the effect that they're having on young people and children of society. But also that imagery of a hand linking to the deeds and actions of society, it suggests that you're actively complicit, meaning you deliberately play a role in the destruction and neglect of these children. And there's a sense of responsibility that is placed on society here by Dickens, suggesting that the destruction and deprivation of these children is a choice, and it's something that society is consciously and actively playing a role in. Therefore, the exploitation of these children is not just allegorical, but it's based on the vulnerability of children in the 19th century. That this was the reality of, children living in poverty. They suffered massively. And therefore, the reader and Scrooge is forced to confront the reality of poverty, and it encapsulates Dickens' broader humanitarian message of helping the poor. And I always ask this question, I always say, why present the children? Like, why is it that Dickens has chosen to present and portray the suffering of children in particular? And it's because they represent the most vulnerable of society, and also it's going to elicit a much greater emotional response from the readers at the time. Now, going back to the Ghost and Ignorance and Want, he describes the children as mans, suggesting that humanity have created this. Again, going back to the hand which twisted and pulled them, we have responsibility over the creation of the children. And then he says, the boy's ignorance, the girl is one. Now, we spoke about the Beveridge report. So this boy is a physical symbol of the evil of ignorance, of the impact of a lack of education. And the girl is a like a character that symbolizes the basic necessities and how they're not met for young people. Now, a little bit more context that you can add in is that Dickens himself was removed from his education. Now, after this, I haven't included the quote, but the Ghost says that you should beware of both of them, but in particular of ignorance, suggesting that Dickens really believed in the power of education, and that how if people are deprived of an education, it's going to have massive consequences on society. Now, Dickens was removed from education because his father ended up in a debtor's prison. Therefore, he went to work in a blacking factory. So he himself had personal experience with the lack of education. And therefore, this could perhaps indicate why he's suggesting that you should beware of ignorance in particular. And this is the final part of Ignorance and Want before we go to stave 4. Scrooge says, have they no refuge or resource? And it's interesting that he cried it. We can slowly see the impact of the ghost's actions on Scrooge here. And then the ghost echoes Scrooge's words. He says, are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? Now, the way that I like to phrase this is we have an ironic reversal of Scrooge's callous attitude. The ghost ironically mirrors Scrooge's attitudes from stave 1 when he was referring to the poor. And it forces him to confront his own responsibility for the creation of the neglect of these vulnerable children. And I think the structure of this stave is really interesting because up until now, the ghost has showed him, yes, he showed him Tiny Tim's death, but he's also showed him the warmth and joy of Christmas. And then he ends the stave with this image of suffering. And he drags him back to this dark reality of the impact of his words. So you go from like these positive moments with the miners and the sea to these vulnerable children who are suffering greatly at the hand of Scrooge's own indifference and greed for money. Now, ending with this commentary, the idea of personal responsibility versus the dismissal to the cruel institutions of the Victorian era. So the workhouses and the prisons, it's forcing the reader to confront, and you need to remember a lot of capitalists at the time, a lot of upper class at the time, a lot of the rich of the time, had these same attitudes as Scrooge, that it's not their personal responsibility to look after the poor, but instead the institutions are there, they're put in place, and the poor should be subjected to the workhouses or prisons. Now, these were obviously very cruel institutions with horrible conditions. So Dickens is suggesting that we need to take personal responsibility over the young people. And this ties in very nicely to Tiny Tim, because again, the image of a child suffering. And you can draw loads of connections between ignorance and want. And to be honest with you, if I was writing an essay, I'd probably include Tiny Tim and ignorance and want in the same paragraph and have that idea or the concept of the children of society suffering as one of the negative effects of poverty. So what should you do for revision? I want you to choose 2 of these tasks to complete. You could expand on these words: beverage, dehumanized imagery, pinch, twisted, pulled, or ironic reversal, and just annotate those words with everything that you remember from watching this. Alternatively, you can choose 3 quotes from this section to analyze. So if you go back, it could be this quote, this quote, this quote, any of these quotes. Choose 3 of them to annotate. Flashcards, which again, I know I say it all the time, the best resource in order to learn this information. You could write down ignorance and want on the back of a flashcard and then some notes on the other side and test yourself or get someone to test you. You could draw an image to represent this section and annotate it with quotes. If you feel like your knowledge of context is not up to scratch, you could go ahead and research Victorian prisons, workhouses, the poor laws, the exploitation of children in the Victorian era, the Beveridge Report, and you could make notes on each of these moments if you feel like you're not secure in your knowledge of context. You could write 1 sentence explaining why the ghost repeats Scrooge's words, or if you're going for a G9, your task could be to write a paragraph for this question. How does Dickens present the vulnerability of children in A Christmas Carol? And within that paragraph, see if you can talk about ignorance and want and Tiny Tim. And next, we are finally moving on to stave 4.